Welcome to Athletes Beyond the Game, the community that helps athletes transition to life beyond sports. I'm Julia.
And I'm Sara.
And each episode will dive into athlete stories and get real about the challenges of navigating life post-athletic retirement.
Welcome back to another episode of Athletes Beyond the Game. We have a very exciting guest joining us today, former professional lacrosse player Matt Striebel, considered one of the best lacrosse players of all time. He was inducted into the U.S. Lacrosse National Hall of Fame in 2019 and the Pro Lacrosse Hall of Fame in 2022 after a decorated 14-year pro career in Major League Lacrosse as one of the best midfielders in the game. In college, Matt was a two-sport athlete where he played lacrosse and soccer at Princeton University. As a Tiger, he was a two-time lacrosse All-American and two-time national champion. And after his collegiate career, Matt went on to win 3 Major League Lacrosse MLL championships and helped claim 2 world championships for Team USA in 2002 and 2010, and a runner-up finish in 2006. He finished his professional career ranking among the top 10 all-time in goals, assists, and points. All right, so Matt, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. We're really excited to have you here. We wanted to just try to dive right in with the first question. So could you tell us your most memorable sports story from your career? But the caveat, it has to be an experience that you learned from or you overcame adversity in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, well, I guess probably 95% of the athletes that you talk to, I think that adversity is going to feature prominently or relatively prominently in just about every story, because I think that there's something about dealing with adversity that basically separates ultimately a good athlete or a great athlete from everybody else. And my career is no exception to that, in the sense that it was kind of forged on the anvil of adversity. In both, I was a dual athlete in college and played little soccer professionally after I graduated from college. But in both sports, I had basically my both careers kind of mirrored each other, interestingly, in the sense that in soccer, I had a lot of success really early and started from the minute I got to Princeton and was really successful. And then in my junior year, I had sort of a positional reconfiguration where I moved from forward to sort of like more of like a wing attacking position. And that wasn't something that I wanted to do. And I went through a period of sort of trying to sort out in my mind whether I wanted to keep playing. I was super grumpy about it. And I think whenever an athlete, we have delicate psyches, and whenever we perceive ourselves as having been slighted, there's this sort of sense of like, oh, I'm going to take my ball and go home, or I'm going to show them who I am and why they shouldn't have done this. And with lacrosse, something similar happened. And I was a returning All-American, senior captain, and I was the quarterback of our offense and playing attack behind the goal. And this guy came in, his name was Ryan Boyle, and he was one of the top 2 recruits in the country at the time. And he was kind of a jerk. And I was like, how is this guy a Division I athlete? How is this guy as good as everyone says he is? And we tried to play the same position for 2 games. And then the coach at Princeton, Bill Tierney, who's a legend in the game, he basically brought me into the office and he was like, hey, Streebs, you've had a great run. We're going to move you to midfield. And I had this sort of 48-hour window where I was like, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to play lacrosse anymore. I'm going to show them what they've done. And then I sort of got a little bit of perspective and sat back and was like, well, if I quit, I'm going to prove that I'm exactly who they think I am. And that's not going to be effective. And then it ended up basically being the perfect switch for me. Midfield was where I should have been playing all along. And Ryan is one of the best attackmen of all time. And he's since become my best friend. And you may not remember, but he was at our wedding. He actually found Kristen's grandfather's, on her mom's side, hearing aid when it fell under the table. So the story, I think the sort of the, I guess the origin story of my lacrosse career is sort of like centered around adversity and in losing my position and having to sort of on the fly my senior year basically learn a whole new gig.
For those like who don't know the different positions of lacrosse, can you explain what that shift looked like for you, like going from, you said, attack to midfielder?
Yeah, it's sort of, so in lacrosse is a little bit, whenever I explain it to somebody who's sort of not initiated, I describe it as kind of a Frankenstein of a lot of other different sports. And I don't know if you're familiar with hockey, but in hockey you can sort of go behind the goal, and Wayne Gretzky was sort of famous for playing from behind the goal because he was looking up the ice and could see where people were, and he was a really good feeder. In lacrosse, you have a similar position. Basically, lacrosse offenses, they're often initiated from top spots above the goal, but the ball usually goes around behind the goal, which causes the defense to have to turn and look, and it sort of alters their perspective, and then you're able to have these really good feeding lanes. And so for my first 2-3 years at Princeton, I was the guy who basically received the ball and decided where it went. I was, as a lot of people say, that's the quarterback of the offense. And then switching to midfield, my entire perspective changed. I went in front of the goal, and what was immediately obvious to me once I did that was one of the things I couldn't do as an attackman. I was really good at beating my guy. I was fast, I was quick, I could break that defender down. It's a little bit like basketball, right? Where you're the point guard, you do a move, you break that guy down, and then the defense has to adjust, and that's how you start offense. I was really good at that. I was not really good at running up the field full speed and then having to shoot behind me at the goal. Okay, it's kind of like a weird aspect of lacrosse, and there's some attackmen who are really fantastic at it. I never was. When I moved to midfield, it was like, oh, wow, I run by my guy, and lo and behold, the goal's still right in front of me. And so I was like, oh, I can just shoot now. That's a lot easier. So that's like the biggest switch. And then the only negative was you're not touching the ball on every possession, and you're not always the guy who's sort of making the ultimate decision, and you have to cede a little bit of that responsibility or power, depending on how you want to describe it, to somebody else.
Can you kind of talk about like what it was like being a two-sport athlete in college? And like also you're at Princeton, right? So you're at a very prestigious university. So I'm curious what that was like, just timing.
It's one of those things that when you say it, oh, two-sport athlete, I think a lot of people are like, oh, wow, that must have been really difficult. And you had all this time you had to manage. And it was never a question for me as to whether or not I was going to do two sports. When I was in high school and looking at colleges, I loved both sports. I was good at both sports. I think, in retrospect, it was actually playing two sports was much more helpful than it ever was limiting or hard or difficult, because I never felt like I had all my eggs in one basket. When you're like a single sport athlete, you're like, this is my jam, I'm doing it. And like, if it doesn't succeed, holy cow, what do I have next? For me, it's like I could have a down game in soccer or a down game in lacrosse, and there was always somewhere else to go. And whenever I was on the verge of burning out in one sport, that season would end, and then I would go into another season, and it was kind of relief. I mean, I played both sports my entire life. They're in opposite seasons, so they never really overlapped in terms of, it's more difficult if you're doing a winter sport into a spring sport or a fall sport into a winter sport. But it was like, I was committed to doing it. So I got to college and I was like, okay, I have soccer, I have lacrosse, I have academics. These are the three biggest pieces. I can balance those things. Maybe my social life and the fun and that side of things is going to have to kind of like take a back seat. And that wasn't that hard of a sacrifice for me. I'm not, it's like, I love playing the sports and being on those teams enough that it never felt like I was like, man, I wish I could be super social and have that be something that I'm doing. So I'm a little bit of a weirdo in that regard. I got to college and I wasn't like, oh yeah, college. I got to college and I was like, I want to be the best soccer player, the best student, the best lacrosse player I can be.
I'm envious of you, and I'm sure a few listening that you were able to kind of like turn your brain off from one sport and focus on the other. As somebody who played a lot of sports growing up, I wish I stuck with two and kind of did what you did. So That's awesome. And then when you decided you were going to play in college, what was that decision like? Was it always I'm playing both and that's it? Or was there a period of time where you're like, maybe I'll play one or the other?
I growing up in New England, and I don't know where you're from, but I know where
New York, so similar.
Oh yeah. Okay. So you get right. Like, so in New England, right? It's like everything you hear when you grow up in New England. I went to a prep school. It's like so education centric.
Yes.
And it's like, if you're not going to an Ivy League school, you better be going to a NESCAC school. And if you're not going to a NESCAC school, don't even consider going to college. Like, that's how ridiculously narrow the college thing was. So for me, it's like when I was in high school, the primary goal was I got to go to the best school I can go to, because that was sort of not drilled into my head, because my parents were never put any pressure on me to do anything, but that's sort of what I wanted to do. And so when I started looking at schools, I started down the NESCAC route because it was much easier to do. It's much easier to do two sports at the D3 level. And that's one of the great reasons to go Division III. I loved Williams. I loved Amherst College. It's kind of odd. I now live in Amherst, so I get to be near Amherst College all the time. But I went to a Brown soccer camp, and I ended up doing, back then they did these camps where as high school students you could play against the current freshman class, or the incoming freshman class. And I went to this camp and did pretty well against these guys who were freshmen in college, and ended up getting recruited by Brown to play soccer. I was recruited by other schools to play soccer. And then I went to, whatever it was, 25, 30 years ago, the camp that you went to for lacrosse was this camp called the Top 205, and it was in Baltimore, Maryland. And my parents basically put me on a train. I took a train to Baltimore. I got off. I was like, how do I get to Loyola University? I got there. I went to this camp. And it's funny, I remember the guy who was running the camp was this like grizzled old coach named Dave Cottle, he wasn't even grizzled then. He was probably like my age now, but he's sort of permanently always seemed grizzled. And he gave this ridiculous speech, the kind of speech a coach always gives, where he's like, we're not looking for the guy who can score all the goals. We're looking for the guy who can ride hard. And that's basically play defense once you turn the ball over. And I was this dumb kid from the woods of New England, and I was like, oh man, all that takes is like athleticism and desire. I can do that. So that first night in like the scrimmages, I just, like, anytime the ball was on the ground, I was a madman trying to get it back. And there was a draft, and I ended up getting drafted third. And again, because I had these soccer opportunities that were sort of like over here, I was so loose and so unencumbered by any pressure or any feeling like I had to do well, that I kind of just played as if I had nothing to lose, and ended up killing it for 4 days at this camp. And then coming out of the camp, I had pretty much every school in the top 15 for lacrosse recruiting me. It was like, that's how fast that happened back then.
That's interesting that you mentioned the lack of, or less pressure, because you have two sports, kind of two different avenues that you can go. And speaking of still going with two sports, I mean, you played professionally in both sports for at least a few years after college. So you, in my understanding, you played 3 years of professional soccer for the Western Massachusetts Pioneers, so during the off season of the Major League Lacrosse. So can you talk?
Yeah, it was like in season, and it was like a total blatant breach of contract. I wasn't supposed to be doing it. And at one point, it was like living the dream, right? Because when I graduated from Princeton, the MLL, which was the first version of professional lacrosse, was just literally that year. I was in the first draft class just starting out. And so after my senior year of soccer, my soccer coach was like, hey, if you want, I can get you a tryout with the Metro Stars, which was the MLS team in New Jersey. And I sort of talked to him and talked to the coaches there, and I was like, what are the chances that I'm going to hang on in this league? I'm going to get to do this for a number of years. And the coach was super straightforward, and he was like, look, probably within 4 years, some retiring European 40-year-old guy is going to come over and take your job, and he's great, and that's how it's going to happen. And I was like, okay. So I decided, I was drafted into lacrosse, and I was like, okay, I'll play lacrosse, but I still love soccer. And one of the things with pro lacrosse is, half of the guys, 2/3 of the guys all work other jobs. You still can't make a really great living. You can, I was able to sort of reach a point where you can piece together the playing and then the coaching and all that stuff, but you really
Is it
have
still like that?
it's
No?
they like to pretend it's not, but it definitely is. You know, there are probably, just as there were back then, there are a handful of top guys who have sponsorship agreements, who are, and there's more of that now. They've done a really good job of branding the sport now, and so there are more guys who are able to do it. Salary wise, it's a little bit higher, but it's still, you know, it's like if you go in that league, like 90% of the guys are still working on Wall Street.
Right. Okay.
So for me, that like those early days, I was working for Warrior, which is the lacrosse equipment company that was partnered with building Major League Lacrosse, the first version of lacrosse. And I was like, I just kind of want to keep playing sports. And so I was practicing soccer because it was local where I was living. So I would practice that all week long. So I was basically using soccer to stay in shape. I would have like a game in Pittsburgh on a Friday night and then drive right after the game to New Jersey and play a lacrosse game in New Jersey. And there's a funny incident where I played a game in Camden over Memorial Day weekend. I don't remember when exactly it was, but I broke my orbital bone in 3 places. I went up for a header and somebody hit me as I was coming down. And I was on the US team for lacrosse at the time. And the next day we had an exhibition game and I showed up with my face all messed up and I had to make up some ridiculous story about how I like walked into a door in the middle of the night. I mean, it was just like utterly ridiculous because all my teammates knew I was playing pro lacrosse and like blatantly, again, in breach of my contract.
That's so funny. I would imagine nowadays you wouldn't really be able to get away with that.
Probably not. Although, I mean, I even if I was playing now, I don't know how active on social media I'd be.
Yeah,
So
true.
there's a chance I could have snuck through the cracks even now.
I'm just thinking about like your day to day of playing 2 professional sports and working a job. And also playing a professional sport that the other team didn't know about and travel and all that. Like, what was your day-to-day like?
So, I mean, what was great was the job that I had for Warrior, I was like a sales rep selling equipment. So I was on the road as it was. Most of the places I was, you know, it's like if I had a lacrosse practice in Connecticut, because the Barrage, the team that I played with, was originally in Connecticut. It was like an hour and a half drive. I could do sales calls on the drive to practice. I practiced soccer locally, and it was like, you know, it's like one of those things. I'm not sure if I fully believe in if there's a will, there's a way, but it seems like if there's a will, there's a way. And it was like, I told the soccer team, I was like, hey, this is where I'm professionally sort of a little bit more focused right now. And they were like, cool, just let us know. I mean, I never missed games for either one. I think I probably missed like 2 practices. It was just like threading the needle. And again, when you're, you know, I was 23, 24, 25, and it's like, what else am I going to do? I'm going to, you know, get in trouble doing something that I shouldn't be doing. Instead, I was basically just playing one professional sport that happened to be split in 2 with a job in the middle.
And for you, I would imagine it was like you were doing this for so long, so it was probably kind of normal. You're like, this is just what I do.
Exactly. And that's when I made the transition from high school to college. Everyone's like, oh my God, you're going to do 2 sports. And I remember, I don't know if you guys had this experience, but when everyone was talking about, oh, playing college sports, everyone's so fast. It's going to be so much faster and blah, blah, blah. And I remember thinking at the time, how much faster can people be? And so it was like, for me, the transition from college or high school to college or college to professional, my mindset was always, I've always been doing this. I've always been playing 2 sports. And until I see a reason to stop, I'm not going to just stop arbitrarily because everybody thinks I'm supposed to.
Right. That's awesome. So what was that moment for you when you decided, okay, I'm going to stop playing soccer. I'm going to pursue lacrosse?
It's a great question. So basically what happened was I applied to grad school. I was working, playing, and in my head I was sort of thinking, oh, I'm either going to go get a PhD in English, or because I was an English politics major at Princeton, and I always sort of was like, oh, maybe I'll get a PhD in English. And then I'd also had this sort of like, I don't know what I'm up to now, but like fourth double life where I was really into like writing and reading. And I thought, you know what, hey, I'd love to just give creative writing a shot. And so I applied to graduate school. I applied to MFA programs, which is coincidentally how I met Sarah Grace's cousin, Kristen, who's now my wife. Met sort of, and she was at the University of Iowa in the writer's workshop at the time, and I was in the process of applying there, and we met, and so I got into Iowa, one of the top programs in the country, and so basically in 2004, I think it was the fall of 2004 or 2005, who knows, somewhere back then, I moved to Iowa. And there was no professional soccer in Iowa, so I had to stop. I basically had to stop playing soccer, and yeah, I just stopped playing soccer. And I was talking with Kristen the other night because both of our kids are really into soccer now, and it's been interesting for me because I don't know what it was like for you guys if you're still playing tennis or if you're playing competitively or what it's like when you stopped. But for me, when I stopped playing soccer, I kind of I've always been really good at compartmentalizing, as you kind of already like guessed. I had to quit cold turkey. So like I stopped playing soccer and that was it. I just kind of closed that door. And now that my kids are back playing it, and my son Sam watches the Premier League religiously, and I've kind of been drawn back into it. And it's weird how this door is opening, and I'm like rediscovering this like love I had for soccer through my kids, and that's been really great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
That is, I mean, and I didn't even think about that, but you kind of did have two retirements in a way. Like you had a retirement from soccer early while you're playing lacrosse, and then when you decided to retire from lacrosse years later. And I want to get back to that, but earlier on you mentioned that the Major League Lacrosse MLL was the first professional outdoor lacrosse league in the US, and it started in 2001, which was also the year you graduated from Princeton. So you were kind of among like the first outdoor lacrosse professionals. So what was that like being, a part of kind of the beginnings of this growing sport and this league?
I'm going to date myself and you guys have never seen it, but there's a movie called Bull Durham, which is about minor league baseball in the South. And it's like a classic. It's Ron Shelton, this guy who played minor league baseball, made this movie, and it's got like Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon. It's like a little profane at times, but it's basically like following these ridiculous minor league baseball players as they're on buses and driving to cities. And, like that's kind of exactly what it felt like early in the beginning. There was this, among those of us who were in the league, there was this sense of kind of like looking over your shoulder, expecting somebody to come and be like, nah, this is all a joke. This actually isn't going to happen. We're not going to pay you to do something you love. There's not going to be stadiums. And there just kept being stadiums and games. And, it became this kind of, it's amazing. And being on teams, for anybody who hasn't experienced it, it's kind of like the greatest thing you can do other than be a part of other than your family, where it's like you're experiencing all these highs and lows, all these miserable, because if we had a game that we had to fly to, we were getting terrible seats on a Southwest flight. We were running to gates. There's none of the, like what you would expect from a professional sport, right, except we would get to a stadium and we'd have uniforms and we'd walk out and there'd be, 1,000 kids who were losing their minds because they knew who you were and you're signing autographs. And it felt for like, probably the first, 7 years I was doing it, like I was kind of cosplaying as a professional athlete.
Right.
And,
right.
But it's like, it's the greatest. It's like, again, you're getting to professionally do something that you love and you're making money on it. And I made enough money to survive. And it's never, it's obviously clearly in lacrosse, it's not about the money because most of the guys all have other jobs, but it's like, it's like when you sign an autograph for a kid or you get like, it was like kids would send me cards and like little plastic things of me
Cute.
like this really polite letter asking for me to sign it. And, you're like, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. So,
How many years did you end up playing?
this is funny. Sarah, you texted me earlier, and somehow it says 13, but I was like, 14 years is how long I played, which was then like one of the longest careers. Partly because I'm a lunatic and just kept playing. Most guys sort of grow up and decide that they want to stop at around the 10-year mark. One of the reasons I played so long is I've always loved the sort of cerebral or intellectual side of sports. And I love the challenge of basically adapting my game so that I could continue playing. Because like lacrosse is a little bit like basketball, where like Jason Kidd is an example of an athlete who early on, he was like this point guard and he was a slasher and he was super athletic. And then by the end of his career, he taught himself to shoot 3-pointers, and he was more of like a little bit more under control. And that sort of happened to me in lacrosse, where early on in my career, I was really physical and athletic. And then as I started to slow down and the game started to slow down for me because I was mentally sharper, I learned how to shoot outside and started shooting 2-pointers. And so I was able to like squeeze the lemon for a long, long time and stay pretty relevant as a player. And that challenge became something that was fun for me as something competitive to keep me doing it.
That's awesome. 14 years. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time. I didn't know how many years, but I wasn't expecting 14.
Yeah. It's funny because it's like, we'll sort of segue into my retirement, but like my retirement from the sport sort of coincided with us having kids. And it's one of those things, a lot of guys that I talk to who retired, like one of the main reasons they retired is because they had kids and they were like, I don't want to miss this time because I'm trying to like get another year in or do this. And that's sort of what happened to me. At the same time that now it's like, I don't have any regrets about how I retired, but if I did, it would be the fact that like Marlo and Sam never got to really see me play. Like they can go on YouTube and watch clips, but it's like, I don't even think they believe that that's me on the internet that they're watching. So I had some teammates who got to have their kids there, and it seemed really cool for them to be able to experience that.
How many different teams were you on?
So if you look at, it's listed, there's like 100 different teams, but part of the reason there were so many is the teams that I was on in that version of the MLL, there was a lot of ownership transfer and teams moving around trying to find locations where they could play. So I was on like the Bridgeport Barrage, then they became the Philadelphia Barrage, and then the Barrage team folded, and then I went to the Chicago Machine, but then the Chicago Machine folded and they became the Rattlers. So I was like, by the end, I think I was on a total of like 4 teams, but it looks like I was on 8 teams.
Right. That makes sense in a growing,
Yeah.
association. So when you look back on it, what are you most proud of?
Boy, it's hard for me not to sound trite or cliche when I say these things.
That's okay.
And I'm like, I think I'm like, in the most conventional sense, the thing that I'm most proud of is being in the first class of the Professional Hall of Fame, because that first class, it's like, and this happened in, I think it was, I don't even know what year it was. It was like 2022 or something like that, when they knew PLL decided, hey, we're going to do a Professional Hall of Fame just for our sport. And they did this first class, and the guys in that first class, it's like, and you guys don't know who these people are, but like Gary Gate and Casey Powell and Mark Millen and Brian Doherty, like they are like the ultimate luminaries of the sport. And I had a poster of the Gate brothers when I first started playing, and I would go watch Mark Millen play, and to be one of 3 midfielders on that team in the first class of the first year of doing it, and having it be selected by the guys I played against and the coaches who coached against me was like, that's like really gratifying, because it's like respect, right? It's not politics. It's not like, how many US teams did I make, or how many coaches did I know who were able to pull strings for me, or it was basically, who were the guys who did it the best, and who were those 10 guys, and these were those guys. And it's like, for me, that's something I'm super proud of. But I think like what I'm really most proud of is how I was able to become that. Because it's like, and you guys know this, anytime you're an athlete, the way you become successful is by figuring out how to be focused on, and again, it sounds super trite, but it's true, the process and like the day to day of just going out and like doing the hard work and the terrible practices and all the stuff that makes that possible. And for me, there were a lot, I was like, in the last round of the draft of the pro league. And it was sort of like I was only drafted because they were like, oh, I think this guy's kind of athletic. Maybe he can survive. And nobody ever thought that I was ever going to be anything great. And I love the fact that I just kind of like under the radar just kept working and becoming better and better and better until like I couldn't be included in that group of 10 in that Hall of Fame class. So that like the process of doing that was the thing that I'm most proud of.
Cool. I'm curious what the contract looked like from the beginning to the last contract you received.
It's a great question. And what's funny, so the first year of the league, there was guys like Gary Gate and Casey Powell, Mark Millen, Roy Colsey, Brian Doherty, these guys who graduated before me from college and were basically playing for the US team, or they were playing club lacrosse, really good club lacrosse around New York, Long Island, Philadelphia, basically the East Coast. And then they started Warrior, New Balance. They decided to start this league. And so they did this dispersal draft where they picked the best guys from that club league and the guys who had been on the US teams, and they sent them basically as the foundational pieces to these teams. And the first year, those guys would get 30 grand to 50 grand. And one of my best friends, this guy, Roy Colsey, who I ended up playing with, he has this great story about telling his wife at the time, hey, this like might be a real thing. I may have to quit my other job and become a full-time lacrosse player. And then almost immediately after that first year, the contracts were like cut in half because the league was hemorrhaging money. Right. And then by the time I was done, as a rookie, I think league minimum was probably like 6,500, okay, 7,500. Yeah, I mean, it was nothing. So it's right. Like, I got, say, like 6,500 there. I had 6,500 playing soccer, and then I had this sales job for Warrior that I got health insurance from. So I was like, okay, cool. That's like a living I can survive on. I was single at the time, so I was like, yeah, I can live out of my car for 6 days a week. Kristen always gives me a hard time because to this day, my car is like the trunk of my car is outfitted with like any kind of athletic gear I might need, like sweats, jackets. It's got all of Marlo and Sam's soccer gear in it so that I can essentially live out of that car if I have to. But by the time I was done, the top guys in the league were making probably 17 grand. Now, I've heard rumors that there's some guys that are making 50. I could give you a clear answer. I know a bunch of guys who are still playing, and I could ask them. I'm
just curious, what that looked like.
There are maybe, like a guy like Tom Schreiber who's been the MVP the last few years and is an all-time great. He might make close to like 75, 100 grand. I don't know. It's not, I mean, it's again, you're playing lacrosse. It's awesome, right. But yeah, it's not like any other it's WNBA contracts are, I was like looking at that and I was surprised at how low they still are. And like Caitlin Clark obviously makes a gazillion in endorsement stuff, right. But the actual salaries are still crazy low. And so that's sort of where lacrosse is. You got to have endorsement stuff.
Yeah, I imagine.
That's kind of crazy. You're playing two professional sports, but still like just trying to scraping by. But I mean, we get that from tennis too. Like when you're starting out in lower levels, you're not making money. So it's definitely huge divide. So I want to transition into now talking about when you decided to retire. And you mentioned a little bit about choosing to retire because you were starting a family, but when you did decide to retire from lacrosse, kind of walk us through that decision. Why did you decide to retire?
It's funny. I pay attention, and it's great that you guys are sort of exploring this because I think it's an interesting and under talked about aspect of being an athlete. And, you know, it's like you'll see like, I don't know, Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers or one of these guys that we've seen retire recently, or LeBron James right now, where he talks about retirement. And there's this sort of like old adage that if you start talking about retirement, you're thinking about retiring. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but as an athlete, you can't not be aware of your own like athletic mortality, because, you know, it's like I'm 35 playing lacrosse against 24-year-olds who are, you know, just out of college. And it's like, man, I've got to keep myself in better shape. I've got to, you know, train harder to keep pace with these guys. And it's like, you reach this point where you're grinding and grinding and grinding, and you're trying to, I use the phrase sort of squeeze the lemon, right? You're trying to get that last bit of juice. And what starts to happen, and I've heard a lot of guys talk about this, where, you know, it's like you play a game on Saturday and you don't feel like you can get back to the gym in earnest and really get after it until Wednesday. When it used to be Monday, you're like, I'm ready to go. Or Sunday, you're driving from Pittsburgh to play a lacrosse game after a soccer game, and you're like, I don't even feel it.
Right.
I started to hit this point where it was like, I'm starting to, you know, it's like getting into the gym. I'm like sore, I'm banged up. But more than anything physical. And I think that this is, to me, this is the most interesting aspect of transitioning from being an athlete, was there was this mental component where I started to basically be miserable. And it was like, I had, when I was at my peak, I was so hot, I was so good, I was so up here that just being good felt bad. And so it's like, I would come out of a game, and the other thing that's sort of the other like essential unfairness of being an athlete is your brain is never better than when you're 35 or 40, but your body's letting you down left and right, right? Like Tom Brady, when he was 45, the game was probably so easy to him. He'd seen every defense, he could adjust, but like your body, you just can't do the things you used to be able to do. And so I would come out of a game and I'd have, you know, 2 goals and 2 assists, where I used to have 4 goals and 5 assists. And all I could think about were the 3 goals I left on the table and the 3 passes I didn't hit because I just didn't get it out of my stick fast enough or whatever it was. And Kristen was the one who was like, dude, you're miserable. Like, this isn't, that you're not seeming like you're having the fun that you used to have, or you don't have the joy. And as an athlete, you get so in, there's so much dedicated, you know, it's like, I always tell people that I think becoming really good at something requires a little bit of pathology. Like being an athlete, you know, it's like I've done a lot of, as I've gotten into coaching, I've gotten really interested in sort of like psychology and a lot of these conversations about sort of like pain and pleasure and dopamine and all these things that we have in our brain. And there's this sort of this conversation around addiction where they talk about how if you stomp on the dopamine center of your brain, there's this scale that needs to be evened out. And so you have to have something negative to balance it out. And I think as an athlete, we use the pain or the difficulty of adversity or the pain of a workout or the struggle of missing a shot or missing a goal as this sort of like way of allowing the payoff of the good things to bring us back to equilibrium. And when the joy of the good things isn't bringing you back to equilibrium, I think you're kind of like, there's like this moment where you're like, man, what is going on? Like, why can't I get back to where I have that homeostasis of feeling like I'm good? And I think that like, for me, if things had gone a little differently, I might have been a little crazy, and lacrosse and sports were definitely a way that I sort of medicated myself into a version of sanity where I had that homeostasis. And, you know, my parents probably could have put me on ADHD medication when I was young because I was bouncing off the walls, until I discovered sports as a way of, again, finding that balance and finding a place where the energy and drive in my head felt like it could be a positive thing.
So as you were going through those emotions and having, clearly the thought like of should I, retire or stop playing, was there anything that you did to kind of prepare yourself for like life after? Did you start thinking about, activities and things you actually enjoyed doing, or was it kind of like, let me retire and then I'll deal with this later?
No, and I think that this is, again, and this is such an interesting topic because I think you're seeing increasingly athletes are getting better at this because I think that we are beginning to understand as athletes that there is this mental health component to it that we have to be mindful of. And so in the past, you see a lot of athletes who stop and suddenly they have this huge void in their lives and they're like, what do I do for meaning? What am I? And I think that that's something that people who don't play sports or do something at a really high level where they've been super dedicated to it can't fully understand, because they look at an athlete who struggles and they're like, but you have money and you have a family and you get to like take these vacations. And it's like, yeah, but I have this empty spot in my brain that I can't fill appropriately. And that's where you see like some of these guys end up, or women end up with substance abuse issues or whatever it is. But I think now, it's like, so for me, the social side of things was something that I set aside, and I built this very carefully curated, everyone jokes about Tom Brady and how much of a wacko he is and eating avocado and doing these crazy things. When I heard that, my thought was, totally get it.
Yeah.
Totally get it. I understand exactly why he did that. And it's nothing about his organization and order and self-control felt remotely strange to me. And one of the things that I was mindful of when I stopped playing lacrosse, everyone would ask me, oh, you must miss playing, you must miss games, you must miss the competition, the camaraderie, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, I was like, I don't miss any of that. I was kind of glad to be done with it. When I retired, I think the thing I felt the most was relief that I didn't, because in my head, I'd had this standard of excellence that I was trying to hit every time I played. I had all these 20-year-olds that were chasing me. And so I was in this kind of burning out spin cycle of trying to stay ahead of those monsters. And so when I stopped, I felt this enormous relief. And pretty quickly, though, the first thing I started to miss was practice. And the first thing I started to miss was basically dedication to craft and to something physical. And this is I recognize how ridiculous this sounds. I've talked with your dad about this, but like I love basketball. I was always pretty good at basketball and I was pretty good at shooting. And so when I stopped playing lacrosse, I started to develop this morning basketball shooting routine where I would go to the gym for an hour and I would shoot 15, this is how crazy I am, 15-minute, 21-second blocks of time. Like that specific block of time where I would challenge myself to try to hit 10 3-pointers in a row from 5 spots and then hit 10 consecutive free throws. If I missed during any one of those 10, getting to 10 blocks, I had to go back to 0. So it was like this game that I created where I had something at stake. I had to be excellent. I had to be mentally sharp. I had to deal with pressure, and I could do it in an hour and however many seconds.
I might steal that.
What's that?
I might steal that.
So
really fun.
It was
Every day. This sounds like I should do that.
okay. So for me, and the other thing that was critical was it wasn't lacrosse and it wasn't soccer. It was something that I could get better at. Because again, what I loved about being an athlete was the daily task of going to get better at something and being able to put in the hard work and then be like, oh, I got better at that, or play a game and then suddenly hit the spot I'd been shooting at 400 times. And so this basketball routine, it's like I put on my podcast, I go for an hour, I shoot at a gym here where I occasionally get UMass students, and they've quickly realized that if they get near me while I'm shooting, I'm going to give them nasty looks, and everybody sort of respects my space in that hour, and I shoot and I walk out, and I know if I have a good day, if I'm able to go 3 for 3 or 4 for 4 on those 15-minute blocks. But whatever happens, I walk out of the gym and it's all still. All that stuff, it's like I leave it there and I've done that work and I'm able to, and it's like Kristen will have these moments during a vacation where she'll look at me and just say, you need to go shoot. You need to go shoot, because she knows that it's like I'm starting to spin my gears a little bit, and she knows me well enough and loves me enough to be like, I don't think you're a jerk right now. I just know that you need to go do this. And that's that. So doing that, and then I've also been able to stay involved because I do so much coaching. My profession now, I do so much coaching. So I'm really involved with the sport in that capacity. So I don't miss playing at all.
That's so interesting that you kind of have found a way to almost like scratch that competitive itch with the shooting. Because I mean, Julie and I have talked about this, of just struggling with finding other ways to have that feeling that you did when you're playing competitively.
The other thing that's I played team sports, right? I didn't play tennis, which is more of a solo sport. But for me, the solitary aspect of practice was always meditation. It was always, even back when I was a kid and I was playing soccer or lacrosse, I would go out into a field by myself, and that time was always centering. And I didn't know it was meditative. I didn't know I just knew that I felt better after doing it. And so there's something about, it's like people assume, oh, you're going to miss, like I said, the games or the camaraderie or all that stuff. And it was like, no, I miss that solitary by myself job of trying to be great.
And you kind of already answered this question a little bit, but when you did retire, were there other things that you did struggle with, or conversely, things that maybe surprised you about retirement?
Honestly, no. And I know that sounds jerky and maybe disingenuous, but I think I'm sort of doing a little self-therapy here and listening as I'm saying these things. I've clearly been good at compartmentalizing. And I think that as an athlete, that's one of those skills that you develop, whether you know it or not, where you finish a set or you finish a quarter and you have to close the door on it and move forward. And I listen to a lot of people talk about self-help and how they stay in the moment or stay present. And I feel like as an athlete, that is the only way to be successful and survive, is you train yourself to stay in the moment, because you can't harp on past mistakes or worry about, whatever's going to come next. You have to stay right between those 2 seconds. So when I stopped playing, I felt that relief of not having to be chased by guys who were really good and really young. And then I was quickly able to, I haven't really played competitive lacrosse since. Mm-hmm. I play pickup basketball every once in a while, but I've managed to find those ways of, because honestly, if you're worth your salt as an athlete, you're not competing against the people on the other side of you anyway. You're always competing against yourself. Yep. So it was never, I never missed competing against anyone else. It was always competing against my own ability to be crazy enough to stay in a gym for an hour shooting the same shot over and over and over and over again, where other people might look at me and think I have a problem. And I probably do, but I've managed to shape it into something that's positive.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of talked really throughout about kind of this athlete mindset that, I mean, you really have to have a certain mindset, one, to be a competitive athlete and play for as long as you did. But can you talk a little bit about how your mindset kind of through your sports journey may have impacted you, now, and maybe impacted you even beyond the sport, of how you just approach things now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the athletic mindset, and I had to work really hard on being in the moment because I'm pretty self-aware and pretty thoughtful, and that's not a great combination for being an athlete because it's easy to get hung up on mistakes. And for my biggest weakness as an athlete was I was such a perfectionist, and so little mistakes could derail me. Or if I went into a game and my first shot missed, I would have to dig out of it. And or conversely, if my first shot hit, I was like, I'm good to go, and I'd be great.
We
What's
sound
that?
very similar. We sound
Yeah.
very similar.
No, and I always hated that because I knew that that was a weakness, and I knew that I had to fix that if I was ever going to be great. And so I really worked on kind of like eliminating superstitions because I was always thinking in my head, superstitions are just ways of controlling the things that I can't control. So I would basically eliminating superstition became a weird superstition. And there were all these mental games about figuring out how to stay in the moment. But I really think that that mindset is fundamentally critical to being a decent anything. And I see it now as a dad. I see it in my relationship with Kristen as a husband, where I can, where one of the things Kristen and I are so similar, and we have this. I think one of the things that I really love about her is how dedicated to getting better at things she is, and she's always, and for her it's on an artistic side, but she's the kind of person who can pick up a guitar and then in a month can sing and do these things because she's just really good at doing that. And that mindset of adversity or failure is not necessarily a characteristic of who you are or how things are. It's just a temporary situation that you can address and fix and work on and get better at. I think that that's it's a growth mindset, right? It's this whole growth mindset that we hear talked about constantly in terms of building grit in kids and building grit in athletes. It's basically this sense of, I'm not smart because I'm smart. I'm not talented because I'm talented. I'm smart because I've studied and worked hard. I'm talented because I put the time in to get that way. And if I'm making mistakes, I can fix them. If I'm double faulting, I can fix it. If I'm hitting I can't hit the broadside of a barn, I just need to go back and spend time. And it's, when I'm now as a parent, the only thing I want to give my kids is the idea that practice or hard work makes you better. So my kids' school, they go to this great school, and one of the things they have this phrase, the magical yet, which is this idea that I can't do it yet. I can't dunk a basketball yet. And there is built into that concept this idea of, if I want to do it, I can get there and I can put in the time. And so anytime Marlo makes a mistake, I'm like, well, you just these are the things and as a dad, I can be like, oh, here are the things you can work on. Just go work on them. Right. It's never, oh, you're bad. Oh, you made that mistake because you're terrible at soccer or hockey or terrible at being a student. It's just because you made a mistake and mistakes are correctable and let's move forward.
I love that mindset.
Yeah.
It's awesome. To kind of wrap up, what advice would you give to an athlete who's, getting ready to retire from their sport or about to graduate?
It's great. It's a great question. I think it's really important for athletes, for people who are transitioning in any period of their life from one thing to another where, one door is potentially closing. And that could be in a job, that could be a sport, it could be whatever. I think you have to ask yourself some really critical questions because everyone's different. Right? For not every weirdo lacrosse player who stops playing misses being alone in a field by himself shooting 1,000 lacrosse balls. There are probably, for every 2 of those guys, there are 15 who actually miss the camaraderie in the games and the competition and all that stuff. So I think the first question or the first thing I would tell anybody who's about to make a shift or close a door and open another one is first to think of it in those terms, to be like, okay, I am closing this door for whatever reason, but I'm going to open another one. And the door that I open has to be open to something that is connected to what I most loved and most valued and most relied on in that other thing that I was doing. So as I said, right, for me, the practice was the thing that I missed. So I was pretty quickly able to find something to practice that I love doing that didn't take 8 hours a day like golf. You know, everyone's like, oh, you should play golf. I'm like, you're kidding me? Golf takes 4 hours and I'd never see Chris and I'd never see my kids and I don't want to do that to them. Basketball takes an hour. It takes an hour out of my day. It's 4 15-minute blocks. It's perfect. It fits into the schedule. I can drop the kids at the bus, go do it, and then get back to work, right? Figuring out what you most needed and relied on and bring that into that next phase of whatever you're doing, whether it's the camaraderie. Do I have to then join a pickleball league so that I'm able, do I have to play pickleball so that I can be competitive and have a competitive outlet? Do I need to join a men's league, or will that make me crazy the way it did me? Like I played one tournament for one Masters. That's the euphemism they use in lacrosse for old lacrosse players. I played one of those tournaments and I was like, nope, that is not it. Never played again. So I think basically figuring out what about that sport, not what you love necessarily, because a lot of the things that we love about it are maybe associated with us being young and fast. So maybe you have to be a little bit more creative and think outside the box. But yeah, what were the mental or emotional things that really sustained you, and how can you bring those forward?
That's awesome.
I love that.
I love that. And I think that'll be really helpful to a lot of people. Thank you so much. This was
Yes,
awesome.
this is amazing. You are
Totally.
awesome.
Totally. Yeah. Anytime. It's a fun thing to talk about, and you guys are doing it needs to be discussed because there's a ton there.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to our conversation with Matt. We really enjoyed diving into his experiences during and after his playing days. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love for you to let us know. You can direct message us or give us a follow on Instagram at Athletes Beyond the Game, or email us at founders@athletesbeyondthegame.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for more real conversations with athletes and their stories transitioning to life beyond the game.